When did your parents' no dating rule completely backfire? My parents' rule was simple: no dating until marriage. Not a typo. They meant I couldn't date anyone unless we were already engaged to be married. Traditional courtship only, supervised visits, the whole thing straight out of a 1950s handbook they probably found in my grandmother's attic. I followed it. Every single rule. Through high school, I watched my friends sneak out to movies and hold hands in hallways while I went straight home after volleyball practice. Through college, I turned down invitations to parties and coffee dates, explaining apologetically that my family had different values. Some people thought I was lying. Others thought I was in a cult. I just wanted my parents to be proud of me. By 24, I started wondering if I'd made a huge mistake. But then Mom came into my bedroom one day morning with this excited expression on her face. She told me she had someone she wanted me to meet. I started to protest, but Mom cut me off, explaining that his name was Timothy, from the Brianna family, the ones from Dad's church network. She went on about what wonderful people they were, how traditional their values were, and how Timothy had specifically asked about meeting me. I should have asked more questions. I should have demanded to know why a complete stranger was asking about me, but I was tired of being the only 24-year-old woman in my social circle who'd never even held hands with someone. I agreed to meet him. We met that Sunday after service. Timothy was handsome in a clean-cut, almost too perfect way. Dark hair, nice smile, good posture. He shook my hand formally and called my father, Sir. He told me it was wonderful to meet me, that my parents had told him so much about me. We sat in my parents' living room while Mom brought out coffee and cookies. Dad positioned himself in the armchair like a referee at a tennis match, watching our conversation bounce back and forth. When I asked what he did for work, Timothy explained he worked in finance, nothing too exciting. But then he said he'd been praying for a wife who shared his values, someone who understood the importance of family and faith. The word wife should have sent up red flags. We'd known each other for approximately 11 minutes, but my parents were beaming. Over the next 3 months, Timothy and I saw each other twice a week, always at my parents' house or his parents' house, always supervised. He wanted 4 children, I wanted 3. I told my best friend Melanie on the phone one night that I thought he was the one. You've never even been alone with him, she said. Don't you think you should actually date him first? I reminded her that wasn't how my family did things. Your family's way is insane. But when Timothy proposed after our 12th visit, down on one knee in my parents' living room with both sets of parents watching, I said yes. His mother hugged me and called me her daughter. We set the wedding date for 4 months away. Then I started noticing small things. The way Timothy always arrived exactly when he said he would, never early. The way he never suggested we bend the rules even slightly. Never asked to take a walk alone or have a real conversation without parents hovering. Mom dismissed my concerns when I mentioned it, insisting he was just respectful, that this was what I wanted in a husband. Timothy talked about his childhood a lot, but the details were always vague. I grew up in the Midwest rather than naming a specific city. My parents moved around for work instead of explaining what his father did. I mentioned it to Dad one evening while washing dishes, pointing out how Timothy never really talked about his past in detail, never said where exactly he'd grown up or what city. When he asked what I meant, I pressed him about the specifics. Where had Timothy grown up? What city exactly? Dad said quickly that Timothy had lived in different places, that his father had traveled for work. He set down the plate when I asked what kind of work. Kimberly, why are you asking all these questions? Timothy is a good man from a good family. That's what matters. I waited until my parents went to bed, then opened my laptop. I searched for Timothy's full name plus finance companies in our city. Nothing. I tried social media. His accounts were all private, except one profile with no photos, created 6 months ago. I called the church office the next morning, explaining I was marrying Timothy from the Brianna family network and wanted to confirm some details about his membership records for our wedding program. The secretary was quiet for a moment. The Brianna family doesn't have anyone named Timothy in their family, honey. I drove to my parents' house. Dad was alone in the garage. Who is Timothy, really? I asked. Dad's face went white. He started to say my name, but I cut him off. Who is he? Dad sat down heavily on his workbench. He's your half-brother. My what? I had an affair 26 years ago, before you were born. Timothy's mother and I. It was a mistake. She moved away. I sent money. When Timothy reached out last year wanting to connect, I panicked. Your mother doesn't know. I thought if I could just... He looked up at me with desperate eyes. I thought if I could bring him into the family properly, through marriage to you, I could legitimize him without admitting the truth. You weren't supposed to find out. You were just supposed to follow the rules. I left without saying another word. I called Timothy, or whoever he actually was, and told him I knew everything. He started crying, saying he was sorry, that Dad had manipulated him too, promising him a place in the family if he went along with this insane plan. Update. Okay, so I know you're all waiting for this update, and honestly, I've been sitting here for the past 3 days trying to figure out how to even start explaining what happened after I posted. Because what I thought was the worst thing imaginable, turns out that was just the beginning of this absolute nightmare my life has become. So when I left Dad standing in that garage looking like his entire world was crumbling, I drove straight to Melanie's apartment. I didn't even remember the drive there. 1 minute I was pulling out of my parents' driveway, and the next I was sitting in her parking lot with my hands shaking so bad I could barely turn off the engine. Melanie took one look at my face when she opened the door and pulled me inside without saying anything. I told her everything. The whole twisted story about Dad's affair and Timothy being my half-brother and this absolutely insane plan to marry us off to legitimize him. Melanie just stared at me for a solid minute before she said, "What the actual fuck is wrong with your father?" Not even a question, just a statement. We were sitting on her couch and she kept getting up and pacing around her living room like she couldn't process what I was telling her. She asked if Mom knew, and when I said no, she stopped pacing and looked at me like I'd grown a second head. That's when my phone started going crazy. Group texts from the wedding planning chat Mom had created with me, her, and Timothy's supposed mother, who I now realized was probably his actual mother. Messages about cake tastings and flower arrangements and photographer schedules. Every notification made me want to throw my phone across the room. Melanie grabbed it from my hands and turned it face down on her coffee table. She said I needed to figure out what I was going to do, and I needed to do it fast because this wasn't going away. I knew I had to talk to Timothy again. Not over the phone this time where he could hide behind tears and excuses. I needed to see his face and figure out if he was really just another victim in Dad's sick plan, or if he'd been in on this the whole time. So I texted him and told him to meet me Thursday afternoon at the food court in Mall. Public place, lots of people around. Nowhere for either of us to make a scene. I was sitting at one of those tables near the Panda Express, and when he walked up, I didn't stand or hug him or do any of the things I would have done a week ago when I thought he was my fiancé. I just looked at him and waited. He sat down and immediately started talking about how sorry he was, how he never meant for any of this to happen, how Dad had promised him a family and a place to belong. I cut him off. I told him to start from the beginning and tell me everything. When did he find out Dad was his father? When did this plan start? And how the hell did he think marrying his own sister was going to work out? Timothy looked around like he was checking to see if anyone was listening. Then he leaned forward and started talking in this low voice. He said he'd known about Dad his whole life. His mother had told him when he was 12 that his father was married to someone else and had another family. She'd shown him pictures of Dad that she'd kept, told him his name, told him where he lived. Timothy grew up in Wisconsin watching from a distance as Dad built this perfect traditional family with Mom and me. I asked why he didn't just introduce himself like a normal person. Why this elaborate charade? Timothy said Dad panicked when he first contacted him. Dad sent him money at first, told him to stay away, said his life would be ruined if anyone found out about the affair. But Timothy kept pushing. He said he deserved to know his father, deserved to be part of the family. So Dad came up with this plan. According to Timothy, Dad had convinced him that if he could join the family the right way through marriage, it would be easier for everyone to accept. That once we were married and established, Dad would eventually reveal the truth, and everyone would be so used to Timothy being around that they'd just accept it. Timothy actually sat there and tried to tell me this made sense to him at the time. He said he was desperate for a father and a family, and he didn't think it through. I asked him when exactly he figured out I was his sister. Like, at what point in this insane plan did he realize he was being asked to marry his own half-sibling? Timothy looked down at his hands and admitted Dad had told him from the very beginning, before we even met. He'd known the entire time. I lost it. Right there in the middle of the food court, I lost it. I told him he was just as sick as Dad, that I didn't care how desperate he was for family. What kind of person agrees to marry their own sister? People were starting to stare, but I didn't care. Timothy tried to reach across the table like he was going to take my hand, and I yanked it back so fast I knocked over my cup of water. He started saying that he thought maybe we could just go through with the ceremony and then get it annulled quietly later, that Dad had convinced him this was the only way. That's when I realized Timothy wasn't some innocent victim. He was a grown man who had made a choice to go along with this because it benefited him. He wanted access to Dad, to the family, to whatever inheritance or legitimacy came with being acknowledged, and he was willing to destroy my life to get it. I stood up and told him to stay away from me, stay away from my family, and if he contacted me again, I'd tell everyone in Dad's church network exactly what he tried to do. I left him sitting there and walked out to my car. I was shaking so hard I had to sit in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I could drive. That's when Mom called. Perfect timing, right? She wanted to know where I was because Dad had been acting strange, and she needed help figuring out what was wrong with him. The guilt in her voice when she said she was worried about him made me want to scream. I drove to my parents' house because this had gone on long enough. Mom was in the kitchen making dinner when I walked in. Dad was in the living room, and when he saw me, his face went gray. I looked at Mom and told her we needed to talk. All three of us. Right now. Mom set down her cutting board and looked between me and Dad with this confused expression. She asked what was going on and why I sounded so serious. Dad started to say it was nothing, that we could talk about it later, but I spoke over him. I told Mom that Dad had something he needed to tell her, something he should have told her 26 years ago. The look on Dad's face was like I'd physically hit him. He kept shaking his head and saying we didn't need to do this now, that we should think about it first. Mom's expression changed from confused to suspicious, and she asked what he was talking about. I looked right at Dad and said, "Go ahead. Tell her about Timothy. Tell her who he really is." And that's when Dad did something I never expected. He turned to Mom and denied everything. He said I'd misunderstood, that Timothy was exactly who they'd said he was, from the Brianna family network. He looked at me like I was crazy and asked Mom if she'd noticed me acting strange lately. If maybe the wedding stress was getting to me. Mom's eyes were going back and forth between us and she asked me what I was talking about. I pulled out my phone and played the voicemail Timothy had left me after our first confrontation. The one where he was crying and apologizing and saying Dad had manipulated him. Where he said he was sorry for going along with the plan to marry his half-sister. I watched Mom's face as she listened to Timothy's voice saying the words half-sister and Dad's plan. Mom grabbed the counter. She asked Dad if this was true. Dad tried to say the recording was taken out of context, that Timothy was confused. But Mom's voice got very quiet and very cold. She told him to stop lying to her. She asked him directly if he'd had an affair and if Timothy was his son. The silence in that kitchen felt like it lasted forever. Finally, Dad sat down at the table and admitted it. He told Mom about the affair 26 years ago, before I was born. He said it was a mistake, that the woman had moved away, that he'd sent money all these years. Mom asked why Timothy was here now, and Dad tried to explain his plan about bringing him into the family through marriage to me. Mom's reaction was not what I expected. She didn't cry or scream or throw things. She just looked at Dad with this expression of complete disgust and told him to get out of her house. Dad started to argue, and she repeated herself louder. She told him to pack a bag and leave and not come back until she said he could. She said she needed time to think and she couldn't do that with him in the same house. Dad looked at me like this was my fault, like I'd betrayed him by telling Mom. I stared right back at him and said he'd betrayed all of us first. He left the kitchen and went upstairs. We heard him moving around in the bedroom, opening drawers and closet doors. Mom sat down at the table and put her head in her hands. She asked me how long I'd known. I told her I'd just found out, that I'd called the church office to confirm some details, and they'd never heard of the Brianna family. That's when I'd confronted Dad. Mom said she'd been married to him for 27 years and never suspected anything. She asked if I'd met Timothy in person after finding out the truth, and I told her about the mall conversation. Mom wanted to know if Timothy had known from the beginning. When I told her yes, that Dad had told him before we ever met, she stood up and walked to the sink. She said something that surprised me. She said she'd always thought there was something off about Timothy. Something too practiced about the way he interacted with our family. She dismissed it as him being nervous, but now it made sense. Dad came back downstairs with a duffel bag. He tried one more time to explain himself, but Mom held up her hand. She told him she didn't want to hear it right now, that she needed space to process what he'd done. She said she'd contact him when she was ready to talk, and until then he should stay with his brother or find a hotel. Dad looked at me again and I refused to feel guilty. After he left, Mom and I sat in the living room for hours. She wanted every detail of my interactions with Timothy, every red flag I'd noticed, everything Dad had said in the garage when I confronted him. I told her all of it. She asked about the wedding and I said obviously it was canceled. Mom nodded and said she'd start making calls in the morning. But here's where it gets even more complicated because apparently this story wasn't twisted enough already. Mom's phone started ringing around 9 that night. It was Francis, Dad's brother. He said Dad had just shown up at his house and was telling him some story about me having a breakdown and calling off the wedding over nothing. Francis wanted to know what was really going on. Mom told him everything. I heard Francis go silent on the other end of the phone and then he started yelling, loud enough that I could hear him from across the room asking what the hell was wrong with Dad. Mom had to hold the phone away from her ear. Francis said he was coming over and hung up. He showed up 30 minutes later. Francis is not a small man, and he looked ready to drive straight back to his house and physically remove Dad from his guest room. He kept pacing around the living room asking how Dad could be so stupid and selfish. He looked at me and apologized. Said he had no idea any of this was happening, that Dad had never mentioned having another son. That's when my phone buzzed with a message. It was Timothy's actual mother. The woman I'd thought was part of some church family network. She said she heard about what happened and wanted to talk to me. She wanted to explain her side of things. And that's where I'm at right now. Mom is upstairs figuring out how to cancel a wedding that's supposed to happen in less than 4 months. Francis is in the kitchen calling other family members to do damage control before Dad tries to spin this as me being unstable. Timothy's mother apparently wants to have a conversation with me about her affair with my father and her role in this nightmare. I have no idea what happens next. All I know is that the man I was supposed to marry in 4 months is my half-brother. My father is a manipulative liar who was willing to let us commit what would basically be incest to cover up his affair, and my entire life has imploded in less than a week. So, yeah. If anyone has advice on how to navigate this absolute disaster, I'm all ears. Last update. Alright everyone, I'm back with what I hope is the last update to this absolute disaster of a situation. To everyone who's been following along and leaving supportive comments, thank you. Seriously. I've been reading every single one and they've honestly kept me sane through the past 2 weeks of my life completely falling apart. So when I left off, Timothy's mother had texted me wanting to talk. I ignored it for 2 days because honestly I didn't know if I could handle another conversation with another person who'd been part of this nightmare. But she kept texting. Not harassing me or anything, just these messages saying she understood if I never wanted to speak to her, but she had things she needed to tell me about Dad and about Timothy that I deserved to know. Finally, on Saturday morning, I was at Target picking up stuff for Mom because she basically hadn't left the house since Dad moved out. And I was standing in the cleaning supplies aisle staring at trash bags when my phone buzzed again. Another text from Timothy's mother, whose name I now knew was Angelica. She said she was in town and would I please meet her somewhere public, just for 30 minutes. I texted back fine and told her to meet me at Riverside Park in an hour. The one with the big walking trail and the picnic pavilions. I figured if she tried anything crazy, at least there'd be joggers and dog walkers around. I finished shopping, dropped everything off at Mom's, and drove to the park. Angelica was already there sitting at one of the picnic tables near the playground. I recognized her immediately from the few family dinners we'd had together back when I thought she was just Timothy's nice traditional mother. She looked older than I remembered, tired. She stood up when she saw me walking over but didn't try to hug me or anything, just gestured to the bench across from her. She started by apologizing. Not the fake kind of apology where someone's trying to make themselves feel better, but this raw, genuine one where she said she was sorry for every single thing that had happened, that she'd made terrible choices 26 years ago and worse choices in the past year. I sat down and told her I didn't come here for apologies, I came here for answers. I wanted to know how she could have let her son agree to marry his own half-sister. Angelica looked down at her hands and said she didn't know that was the plan until it was already happening. When Timothy had first told her he'd made contact with Dad and they were building a relationship, she thought maybe her son would finally get the father figure he'd always wanted. She said she'd been young and stupid when she had the affair with Dad, that he'd told her he was going to leave his wife, but then I was born, and he chose to stay. She'd raised Timothy alone and always felt guilty that he didn't have a father. I asked her point blank when she found out about the marriage plan. Angelica said Timothy told her Dad had this idea about bringing him into the family through marriage, that it would legitimize everything. She'd immediately told him no, that it was insane and wrong and he needed to walk away. But Timothy had been so desperate for Dad's approval that he convinced himself it would work out. According to Angelica, Timothy had told her that Dad promised the marriage would just be a formality, that they'd get it annulled quietly after a year or so once everyone was used to him being around. She said she'd threatened to come forward and tell everyone the truth, but Timothy begged her not to ruin his chance at having a real family, so she'd stayed silent and hated herself for it. I asked why she was telling me this now. She said because Timothy had shown up at her hotel room the night after our mall conversation absolutely destroyed. He'd admitted that he'd actually developed real feelings for me during our supervised visits, that he'd started to convince himself maybe we could make it work somehow. That's when Angelica realized how deep into this delusion both Timothy and Dad had gotten. The way she described it made me want to throw up. Timothy had apparently convinced himself that since we'd never met until adulthood and didn't grow up together, it wasn't really that wrong, that we could be married and just never tell anyone the truth. Angelica said she'd told him he needed therapy and to stay far away from me and my family. I asked where Timothy was now. Angelica said he'd gone back to Wisconsin. She'd bought him a plane ticket and driven him to the airport herself. She said he was planning to stay with friends there and figure out his life away from all of this. I told her that was probably the smartest decision anyone in this situation had made. Then she asked me about Dad, whether he was still trying to defend himself, or if he'd actually taken responsibility for what he'd done. I told her the truth, that Dad was staying with his brother Francis, and as far as I knew, he was still trying to spin this as a misunderstanding. Angelica shook her head and said that sounded exactly like the man she remembered from 26 years ago. When I finally went back to Mom's house that evening, I found the place full of people. Francis was there with his wife Ivy. Mom's sister Darren had driven up from 2 hours away. Even Melanie was there. Apparently Mom had called her asking for support. They were all in the living room and the conversation stopped when I walked in. Francis looked at me and asked where I'd been. I told them about meeting Angelica and what she'd said about Timothy going back to Wisconsin. Darren wanted to know if we could trust that he'd actually stay away. Francis said it didn't matter because if Timothy showed his face around here again, Francis would personally make sure he regretted it. Mom had been quiet this whole time, but then she spoke up and said we needed to talk about Dad. She'd apparently spent the morning on the phone with a divorce attorney. Not because she definitely decided to divorce him, she made that clear, but because she needed to understand her options. The attorney had told her that Dad's affair and the financial support he'd been sending Timothy all these years would be major factors in any settlement. That's when Francis dropped another bomb. He said Dad had been using money from the family business to send to Timothy. Francis and Dad co-owned a small accounting firm their father had started, and Francis had gone through the books after Dad moved in with him. He'd found regular transfers going to an account in Wisconsin for years. Thousands of dollars that Dad had been hiding from everyone. Mom went very still when she heard this. She asked Francis how much money exactly. He said he was still going through everything, but it looked like at least $70,000 over the years, maybe more. Money that should have been going to business expenses or family savings. Money that Mom had never known about. Ivy started talking about how they needed to confront Dad immediately, that he couldn't just hide out at Francis's house avoiding consequences. Darren agreed and said someone needed to make him face what he'd done to this family. Mom said she wasn't ready to see him yet, but she wanted Francis to tell him that she knew about the money and that her attorney would be contacting him. That night, after everyone left, Mom and I sat in the kitchen and she asked me how I was really doing. Not the polite way people ask when they don't really want to know, but actually asking. I told her honestly that I felt like my entire life had been a lie, that I'd followed every single rule they'd set for me, stayed pure and traditional and obedient, and look where it got me. Almost married to my own brother because Dad was too much of a coward to admit he'd had an affair. Mom started crying, Real crying, not the quiet tears she'd been doing since Dad left. She said she'd failed me as a mother, that she should have questioned why Timothy seemed so practiced and perfect, that she should have protected me better. I told her this wasn't her fault, that Dad had lied to both of us. But here's the thing that really got to me. Mom said she'd been thinking about all the rules they'd raised me with, the no dating until marriage thing, the supervised visits, all of it. She said she'd always thought those rules were protecting me, but really, they just made me vulnerable. I'd never had the chance to date normally, to learn what real relationships felt like, to develop instincts about when something was wrong. I'd been so desperate to follow the rules and make them proud that I'd ignored every red flag with Timothy. She apologized for that, for raising me in a way that made me easy to manipulate. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to be angry at her for it, but mostly I was just tired. The next few days were a blur of canceling wedding vendors. Mom and I divided up the list and started making calls. The venue was the worst because we'd already paid a non-refundable deposit of $3,000. The dress was the hardest part. I'd already had 2 fittings, and the final one was supposed to be next week. The bridal shop said they could resell it if it hadn't been altered too much, but we'd lose half of what we'd paid. I told Mom to sell it. I never wanted to see that dress again. During all of this, Dad kept trying to reach out. He'd text me these long messages about how I needed to understand that he'd only been trying to help Timothy, that bringing him into the family had seemed like the right thing to do, that I was too young to understand how complicated adult relationships were. I finally texted back and told him that manipulating your daughter wasn't complicated. It was evil, and to stop contacting me. He showed up at the house on Thursday. Mom had gone to the grocery store, and I was there alone sorting through wedding RSVPs that we needed to uninvite. I heard his key in the lock and came out of the dining room to find him standing in the entryway looking uncomfortable. I asked what he was doing here. He said this was his house too, and he had a right to get some of his things. I told him Mom had specifically said he wasn't supposed to come by without calling first. He ignored that and walked past me toward the stairs. I followed him up to the bedroom where he started pulling clothes out of the closet. He tried to make small talk, asking how I was doing and if I'd talked to Timothy. I told him Timothy had gone back to Wisconsin, thank God, and that I'd met with Angelica. Dad froze with a shirt in his hands and asked what she'd told me. I said she'd told me everything. About how he'd promised her he'd leave Mom 26 years ago and then didn't. About how he'd been sending money to Timothy all these years. About how he'd convinced Timothy that marrying me was somehow a legitimate plan. Dad put the shirt down and turned to face me. He tried to explain that things had been complicated back then, that he'd made mistakes, but he'd been trying to make them right. I asked him how exactly having me marry my half-brother made anything right. He said if I would just listen, he could explain the whole plan, that it made sense if I understood all the pieces. And that's when I realized Dad actually still thought he'd done nothing wrong. He genuinely believed that his plan had been reasonable and that everyone else was overreacting. He started telling me about how hard it had been to balance supporting Timothy secretly while maintaining his life here. How stressful it was to keep the secret all these years. I cut him off and told him I didn't care. That he'd had 26 years to tell the truth, and instead he'd chosen to manipulate everyone around him. That he'd been willing to let me marry Timothy and live a lie forever, just so he didn't have to face consequences for his affair. That he was selfish and delusional, and I wanted nothing to do with him. Dad's face changed then. He got this cold expression and said I was acting like a child throwing a tantrum. That when I matured and had my own adult relationships, I'd understand that sometimes you had to make hard choices. That he'd been protecting me by not telling me the truth sooner. I laughed. I told him that protecting me would have been not introducing me to Timothy in the first place. That protecting me would have been dealing with his own mess instead of dragging me into it. That I'd spent 24 years following every single rule he and Mom had set, being the perfect obedient daughter, and this was how he repaid that trust. He tried to reach for my shoulder and I stepped back. I told him to finish packing his stuff and get out. He asked where he was supposed to go and I said I didn't care. That Francis's house or a hotel or back to Wisconsin were all options, but he wasn't staying here. Mom came home while Dad was still packing. She took one look at his car in the driveway and came inside ready for a fight. She found us both in the bedroom and asked Dad what he thought he was doing. He said he was getting some clothes since he'd been kicked out of his own house. Mom said calmly that he'd kicked himself out when he decided to have an affair and lie about it for 26 years. They started arguing. Real arguing. Not the polite disagreements they'd had throughout my childhood. Mom brought up the money Francis had found, asked Dad how he could steal from his own business and family to support his secret son. Dad tried to say it wasn't stealing. It was his money too. He could use it how he wanted. Mom said that money should have gone to their actual family, to my college fund and their retirement and the mortgage. Dad said Timothy was his actual family too, that he'd had a responsibility to support his son. Mom asked why that responsibility was more important than being honest with his wife and daughter. Dad didn't have an answer for that. The argument went on for maybe 20 minutes before Dad finally grabbed his bag and left. Mom and I stood at the bedroom window watching him drive away. She said she was calling her attorney on Monday to file for divorce. She'd spent the past 2 weeks trying to decide if the marriage could be saved, but after seeing him today, after hearing him still defend his choices, she knew it was over. I asked if she was sure. She said she'd never been more sure of anything, that she'd spent 27 years married to a man who was capable of this level of deception and manipulation, and she was done. The church community found out about everything the following Sunday. I don't know who told them. Maybe Francis or maybe Dad tried to spin his version of events. But by that afternoon, my phone was blowing up with messages from people I barely knew. Mom and I decided not to go to service that day or the next. We needed space from all of it. Melanie came over and we spent the day watching movies and eating pizza and not talking about Dad or Timothy or any of it. It was the first normal day I'd had in weeks. By Monday, Francis had told us that Dad had moved out of his house too. Apparently, Ivy had made it clear that Dad wasn't welcome there anymore after what he'd done. Dad had gotten a short-term rental apartment across town. Francis said Dad was still working at the firm, but they'd had a serious conversation about the money situation and Dad had agreed to pay back everything he'd taken. So that's it. That's the end of this nightmare. My engagement is canceled, my parents are getting divorced. I'm moving out on my own, and I'm starting to build a life that's actually mine, instead of one that follows someone else's rules. And to anyone else out there in a situation where family or religion or tradition is being used to manipulate you, trust your instincts, question everything, and don't be afraid to break the rules when following them means destroying your own life.